Today's presentation is Payment Pressures in U.S. Specialty, Status Quo and Outlook for Future Financing. Next slide, please. Our speakers for today are Dr. Barbara Pannone and Dr. Max Vargas. Barbara is currently a Senior Director of U.S. Access Strategy at Certara. She has more than 13 years in U.S. and global market access experience, and she's led more than 300 projects assessing early-stage assets and developing market access strategies. Joining Barbara is Max, who's also a Senior Director of U.S. Access Strategy at Certara. He oversees projects in launch pricing, contracting, market segmentation, and due diligence, and he's experienced across all major therapeutic areas and care settings. Barbara and Max, welcome to today's event. I'll now turn it over to Barbara to begin the presentation.
Hi, thank you so much for the introduction. So I'm going to start off the webinar, going through the first half of the discussion and then turn it over to Max later. And just a little bit of a disclaimer about the research that we're going to walk through today. What you'll see here is based on qualitative research methodology. We try to report the findings here, not only by share of payers, but also by share of covered lives to really get at more representative findings. The number of lives are reported from our respondents, so are an estimate. And the research also does not account for any overlap in covered lives between health plans and PBMs. So the trends that we'll share with you today should really be considered indicative rather than conclusive. So just an overview of the objectives of this project and this study and the methodology. So the objectives of this study really were to understand what are payers' current challenges in the specialty pharmacy space. So what are their concerns about this category? And then importantly, what are they currently doing to address those concerns? And looking ahead to the future, what do they expect to continue doing or begin doing? So to try to understand and answer these questions, we conducted both primary and secondary research with managed care payers in the US. So this was a combination of an online survey of active voting members of P&T committees in US managed care organizations, followed by in-depth telephone interviews for further qualitative findings on responses. Our panel were all active voting members of P&T committees in their organizations, a mixture of medical and pharmacy directors. All were recruited from our proprietary in-house Compass payer panel that has been developed over the past 15+ years. So these are payers that we speak to and have well-established relationships with. The total panel represented here were 31 respondents, representing a total of nearly 200 million US lives. The majority of our respondents are responsible for both commercial and Medicare lives, so one respondent is able to provide both perspectives. And in addition, we were able to segment our payers by plan type, so we have national and regional plans represented, as well as PBMs and IDNs. This research, which we are only presenting a part of today, has been published in the Journal of Managed Care Pharmacy in a poster awarded a gold ribbon at a recent AMCP conference. And I would also like to acknowledge Isha Banja and Ulrich Newman, who were key contributors to this project. So looking to the right-hand side of the slide here, the 5 key drivers of change in this category that we really took a deep dive on in this research are shown here. Today in our discussion, we're going to focus on these 3 with the yellow arrow, so utilization management, distribution disruption, and alternative financing. These other 2 topics, ICER impact and major policy proposals, will be discussed in a subsequent webinar taking place next month. So let's start off with a definition. So what is a specialty drug? What are we talking about when we say that? So while there's no universally accepted definition, some typical criteria include things like high cost. These products are often in the range from $10,000 per year up to $7 million per year. They may be physician or patient self-administered and therefore covered on either the medical or pharmacy benefit. They're typically treating more complex chronic conditions, such as multiple sclerosis, rheumatoid arthritis, and oncology. They may require special handling or ongoing management by a pharmacist or physician, for example, to track compliance or educate members on use if it's, for example, a sub-Q self-administered product. So as part of our research, one of the things we asked our payers was, what indications within the specialty category have the biggest budget impact to the health plans? So the top three that were identified include inflammatory, oncology, and diabetes as those with the biggest concern. So not only a large patient population, but also high-cost therapies in those categories. There has been tremendous growth in the specialty category over the last few years, with an estimated 60% of new products awaiting FDA approval through 2021 being specialty products. It's also expected that about 65% of new approvals in the next few years will be for rare diseases. And as you can see here in this graph, looking at pharmacy spend, the spend in the specialty category continues to grow. The key drivers for the increased spend include increase in unit cost as well as increased overall utilization of these products. So whereas in 2015, you can see the breakout of traditional drug spend versus specialty spend totaled about $426 billion in 2015. If we look to the present time in 2020, that total spend has increased to $513 billion, with specialty drugs accounting for nearly half of that. And the trend in growth in the specialty category has been at about 10%, represented by this green line here. So we asked payers, first, what are some of the top challenges that they are facing in the specialty category? And then what do they see as opportunities to help manage and control costs in the category? So a couple of things came out, including first, increased utilization and expanded indication for these drugs, just leading to a greater number of members taking these specialty products. Secondly, a large number of rare disease products being introduced overall, not just, so while a patient population may be small for a specific orphan disease, the increase across all rare diseases has been growing. And then lastly, entry of one-time treatments, so gene therapies, one and done types of treatments. The concern there that Max will go into a little bit later is obviously the high initial outlay. Looking at a product like Zolgensma priced at $2 million per treatment. Payers are struggling with how they will manage the cost of that upfront cost as more of these therapies emerge. So how are payers beginning to address these growing budget concerns with specialty drugs? So one is opening up the opportunity for additional contracting. This is especially, there's an opportunity here in categories where there are a number of options and perceived as undifferentiated. So that opens the door for contracting and potentially excluding products. Secondly, adopting more aggressive utilization management tools. So these types of tools are no longer just limited to the traditional drugs covered on a pharmacy benefit, but expanding to medical benefit and specialty products as well. And then lastly, using more restrictive benefit designs. So for example, moving to a closed formulary design where not all FDA approved products will be covered. Medicare has already shifted to this type of design, but commercial plans are following suit, and more covered lives are being included in a closed design. So our first topic we'll cover is utilization management trends. So based on the findings from our survey, we've identified 8 trends in utilization management tools for the specialty product category, and these are shown here. So I'm sure most of these sound pretty familiar to you and are commonly used for more traditional pharmacy benefit products. You can see quantity limits and step edits are quite common. And just a reminder that the goal of all of these utilization management tools are really to help plans reduce costs and drive patients to lower cost options. One other thing just to point out is that specialty drugs may fall under the pharmacy or medical benefit, depending on whether they're self-administered or physician-administered products. In general, payers have been slower to adopt these kind of utilization management tools on the medical benefit side, but this is beginning to change, and we've definitely been seeing this trend over time, not just the results of this survey, but overall. And even these specialty products are not immune to increased management, which, for example, was the case in oncology in the past, where payers were hesitant to restrict access or exclude anything, but that is beginning to change. So while the full report goes into all of these trends that we identified, here today in our discussion, we'll focus on just 4 of these. So PAs, narrower than the FDA label, reauthorization criteria, exclusion of products, and use of evidence-based pathways. And I'll just quickly, since the others are probably you're well familiar with, I'll just point out designated preferred medical benefit specialty products. So this is an effort to begin more and more contracting on the medical benefit side. While on the medical benefit, there are no tiers as we have on the pharmacy benefit side. So the way plans may prefer a medical benefit product would be either a step through the PA or perhaps a higher level of reimbursement for the preferred product. So let's first talk about PAs beyond the label and reauthorization criteria. So first, what does this mean when we say a PA beyond the label? So here, what we're noticing payers are doing is they are developing the PA criteria based on the clinical study design. So for example, they may look at the trial inclusion and exclusion criteria, things like age or comorbidities in designing their PA. They may also look at subgroup analysis from the pivotal trial to see if certain groups had a better response to the therapy, and then they may consider limiting use to that specific patient group. The important thing to note here, though, is that payers will only turn to these types of more restrictive utilization management tools when the cost is perceived as beyond the value, or when payers do not perceive the value there. And this is something that when we do our projects, it's something we frequently test with our payers to look at a series of price points. At what point will payers begin using these more restrictive criteria, and what's the point where these are lessened or reduced? So currently, based on our research findings, about 55% of payers in this survey actually use a PA beyond the label for about 70% of lives. And this is actually greater for PBMs. So first, looking at this figure on the left, just to orient you, because I think the labels are missing, dark green represents commercial lives, and the light green is Medicare. We've segmented the findings by average across all payers, and then by type of plan, so PBMs, large, mid, small plans, and IDNs. So what we're showing here is the likelihood for future expansion of use of this utilization management tool by payers. So across all payers, they report being somewhat likely to expand use of this tool. This is actually greater for PBMs and large plans. The other trend that was identified is the use of reauthorization criteria. So here, this is where payers require confirmation of clinical response to the drug. So for example, in the PCSK9 category, payers may track LDL levels at the start of treatment, and then after about 6 months to a year, require this reauthorization to track LDL levels to see if there was a response. And the goal there is to ensure that patients are responding properly and that continued use is warranted. So this reauthorization criteria usually occurs every 6 months to a year, typically. And about 2/3 of payers in our study are currently using this type of tool. But as you can see, the likelihood for future expansion of this tool is highly likely for across all payers. not just limited to PBMs and large plans, but across all payer types. So the key implication here for manufacturers is really pay attention to that clinical trial design. Clinical and commercial teams should be aligned on product strategy early on and designing that clinical trial with that understanding that payers will dive into that clinical study inclusion-exclusion criteria when developing their PA, so that if possible, that trial design should be as broad as possible. And just one sort of real-world example in a category that we've been assessing are the PCSK9s, so Praluent and Repatha. So those products initially launched at $14,000 per year, and at that price point, payers did not perceive the value of those products, and neither did ICER in their review of the category, and deemed them as being not cost-effective at that price. So the result of that was that payers highly restricted use of these two products. They were covered on the specialty tier, where patients have a much higher cost share, and there were trial inclusion-exclusion criteria, reauthorization criteria put in place for those products. The result was that there was ultimately low utilization of these products due to that burdensome PA. But the manufacturers ultimately dropped their price about 2 years ago to $5,900, and we saw the response from the payers. So they have since loosened the criteria and dropped the tier to either preferred or non-preferred. So again, just to stress that it's really this type of restrictive criteria is based on price, directly reflected on price. And then the other point to make about this topic is that there is a consequence to these more restrictive PAs and reauthorization criteria, and that is an increase in patient and provider burden. So looking at the graphic here, in 2014, there were 4.4 billion annual prescriptions. About 6% of those were initially rejected for various reasons at the pharmacy. 30% of those ultimately got resolved, but 70% were rejected, whether it was because the PA was not filled out, there was information missing, or the request was denied. So at that point, it would have to go back to the physician. A physician can request an appeal on that denial, but the end result is that 40% of those prescriptions are ultimately abandoned due to the complex policies and procedures in place. So these utilization management tools have been met with physician pushback. You can see here at the bottom some findings on the physician side. They report that these tools have had a negative impact on patient outcomes, cause delays in patient care, and result in patients stopping treatment. So, one result of this is that it could lead physicians to turn to other products in the category that perhaps have an easier PA approval process or do not have a PA at all. And the other thing to note here is that the ability for a physician group to handle the PA will vary by specialty. So oncology practices are familiar with the process, have administrative staff ready to handle it. But other types of practices, such as primary care, may not be set up to handle it. So the key implication here for manufacturers is, one, understand the key prescriber of your product and who that will be, and consider the use of specialty pharmacy or physician support programs to assist physicians in going through this PA process. And we actually had some real-world findings on this specific topic. In a recent project, we were looking at a category where there are two products in the category, both very similar, similar efficacy, safety, price, even access. But our client was seeing a decrease in utilization of their product versus their competitor. And one of the key reasons for that was that the competitor had a very strong physician support program in place to help physicians manage this PA process. Whereas our client had actually cut funding for their own program. So the physicians, all it takes is one negative experience going through this process and they will turn, in this case, they turned to the competitor product, which was much easier to deal with. So I'm going to turn it over to Max now to talk about one of the other trends that we've identified. So Max?
Thanks, Barbara. Hi, everyone. So I'll pick it up here with the medical exclusions, really. And here you're looking at a graph of the number of products excluded over time since 2012 at the two major PBMs, Express and Caremark. Obviously, it's increased over time as we go. And what this began in about 2012, and it started off with, some sort of obvious exclusions like branded products that had, that were now multi-sourced, et cetera, and just, some very sort of fully commoditized categories where, no big deal if a product or two gets excluded. And for the clients of these PBMs, it makes total sense because they can lower the net cost of that particular class quite readily by doing that. But over time, as the numbers have grown, the products excluded have really, or the classes really subject to exclusion have really began to broaden. I'm sure some folks in the audience have checked out the major exclusion lists that are published each year and then get updated. And you can see that the categories included here are, they are life-threatening diseases. There are rare diseases on there. The oncology is there. So just over time, we've seen a general migration of the ability to use an exclusion strategy into categories where it might make you raise an eyebrow, but nonetheless, it's happening. So in 2017, CVS brought in rare diseases into their exclusion, and then and in 2014, Express Scripts started excluding some of the inflammatory indication products. Importantly, though, all of that growth in this chart has really been related to pharmacy benefit products. However, very recently, as of 1920, these PBMs started excluding products that are generally covered under the medical benefit, which is a new thing, a new trend. So it seems that the medical benefit as sort of this protected area before is no longer protected. And you can see in the text on the right here, on the left, excuse me, the results from our research. So about a quarter of the payers in the panel exclude products on the medical benefit, and that exclusion applies to at least 70% or greater of their commercial lives. So not every employer group, is going to go along with it, but a lot of them do. And then, just looking forward ahead to the future, more than 2/3 of the panel said that they are likely to exclude specialty products on the medical benefit going forward. So what does this mean? Importance to manufacturers. I know the bit on the bottom is cut off, so I'll just cover that. What does this say to the manufacturer community? It really says that in some cases, and I know it's not for lack of trying, but the payers are just not seeing the differentiation among products in certain categories. They're going right to price, but again, that clinical story needs to be made prior to getting into the price discussion, so that your product is not even in consideration for getting on one of these lists. And how is that done? Well, find the points of differentiation, find the product attributes that support the value, And this really starts quite early in the development, I would say, and as you're getting through phase 2 and think it's going to go forward. Make sure that the trials are planned, the pivotal trials are planned such that the data included, it will allow sufficient differentiation versus competition at the time of launch. And that's, that sort of commercial assessment and planning has to start quite early. And then of course, update it as the market changes and as your product gains more and more data coming forward to market. So we can go to the next slide, and we'll talk about some evidence-based pathways here. So the use of, this is another trend that Barbara gave in the intro, the use of evidence-based pathways here. We see it's, I'll just walk you through the chart first and then talk about some of the implications. So you can see that on the bars towards the middle of the slide are showing the share of lives for which an evidence-based pathway is in place in a specialty category. So you can see that the average, the first set of bars, is right in the right around the 30%, implemented for about 30% of lives. Again, this is really dependent on who's the ultimate payer. So employer groups and individuals, that's sort of what they buy, and as to how widely these things get implemented. But a couple things I just wanted to call out on this bar chart. You can see that the IDNs all the way down at the bottom are very, clearly segmenting themselves from the rest of the payer types represented in this panel, implementing evidence-based pathways for somewhere between 50 and 70% of lives. And then going to the little dots on the right, likely to highly likely to expand that in the future. It may be self-evident, but the IDNs generally have a better handle on harmonized data that they can use to look at treatment pathways currently, and then the relationship that they often have with their provider groups is one, it's obviously beyond a contractual relationship, and it is one that allows the P&T committees and the medical policy committees to really have a collaborative discussion and say, okay, this is what guidelines say, this is what the evidence says, and then, hey, look at our data, what we're actually doing, this is how we're doing things. And when you have that discussion, you generally have a really good agreement and alignment with any pathway that is ultimately put in place. If it's outside of the IDN setting, these pathways are there can be some financial incentives for the physician group if they stay on the pathway, or a certain share of patients are on a pathway for a certain period of time, et cetera. And then just so that I want to just call out that one point on the IDNs. The rest of the segments are kind of, they're all kind of grouping around the somewhat likely to likely in terms of expansion. And this is just, as Barbara said in the beginning, this is just another method to manage cost and provide a more standardized approach to using evidence to support clinical decision making. So where does this happen? Primarily oncology, but also rheumatology, cardiology, diabetes, and multiple sclerosis were also picked up in our research. And then, as I said, the IDNs probably more facile, and that includes some large plans too, more facile with their data to be able to have that discussion. Thanks, Barbara. To be able to have that discussion with their physician groups and ensure good alignment. A couple notes on oncology here. These pathways are typically developed generally for first line treatment because number one, the patient volumes are bigger. Second, third, et cetera, lines of treatment, patients start to kind of segment pretty dramatically, so that the treatment has to get more and more personalized and individualized as the patient progresses. So really looking at the first line of oncology treatment is sort of a target for these pathways. In 2019, I'll just mention this last part here. 2019, Express Scripts estimated that 1.3 billion with a B could be saved annually in specialty costs by implementing evidence-based pathways for medical benefit drugs, similar to what's been done on the pharmacy side. So, again, just bringing in this trend, this theme of medical benefit being sort of more of a target as payers look to manage costs going forward. So the findings, the implications, guidelines, the national third-party guidelines are very important here because they are often the best source and the primary source that payers use to develop any pathway that is implemented in their organization or in their networks. So obviously that's a major or should be a major strategy focus for any developer, any manufacturer, is obtaining a good position in those guidelines. Consider timing. So often guidelines are updated on a schedule, depending on the association, and P&T committees will sort of, we've seen this happen, they restrict access at the beginning while they wait for an updated guideline to come, and then sort of design their sort of long-term criteria around what those guidelines are. So consider that timing relative to your launch. And then, of course, support all the stakeholders that are involved there. So the major physician groups with KOL advocacy, et cetera, and ensure that payers are using and considering all the evidence to develop any pathways. So let's go forward to the next thematic area, which is distribution, and we can go to the next one here. Yep. So payers, this is really focused on the payer control of the site of care and therefore how it gets billed. So what you see in this, this triangle here just kind of is a little graphical representation of, the limited versus broad distribution all the way at the bottom. And on the right of the slide, you can see some of the benefits or really the factors that support a limited distribution strategy. And this is partially the manufacturer's choice. So we'll talk about that for a minute. Small patient populations where you have an indication with a small patient population that makes sense. You can funnel to either a specialty pharmacy, 1 or 2. And then if it's a medical benefit drug, you can ideally funnel to centers of excellence. Payers, and I'll talk about that in a moment as well, payers generally like that. Greater control over inventory, that makes sense just from an inventory perspective, just to simplify the ins and outs and the distribution. Better access to data. Specialty pharmacies are often, they allow a number of, or they help manufacturers with a number of additional services that can provide very valuable patient-level data to manufacturers. Control over REMS program, if that's in play, they can help with that. Integration with reimbursement hubs so that there is no or as minimal friction as there needs to be between getting a drug authorized and actually filling it. and need for higher quality management of patients. Obviously, the level of contact with some of these drugs and categories that is required with patients is great, and there's a lot of education that comes with that. So that's another reason why a limited distribution strategy could make sense in this case. So what are payers doing in this area? So about more than a quarter of the panel say they're going to expand their use of specialty pharmacy. And what does that mean, really? It means that they're trying to, one option is trying to shift away from buy and bill on the medical side, and have basically to eliminate physicians and hospitals from the reimbursement, from the financial aspects of provision of drugs, basically, and removing that margin. It also allows, running things through as a pharmacy claim also allows a lot more control and management over medication use as compared to a buy and bill product. And excuse me, the reason for this obviously is the trend, the sort of macro trend of hospitals purchasing private practices. And whenever that happens, payers have seen significant markups of physician administered products in those claims because they then get to be billed under a different contract. So, you know, we've seen a couple of sort of case examples. We've seen certain commercial geographies, also in Medicaid and managed Medicaid in some areas, where payers will actually reimburse physicians only at the specialty pharmacy rate, which may leave the provider underwater for that claim if they bought and billed it. And this is kind of a, you know, the way it was explained is that you have a number of let's go. Okay, I guess there's a slide problem. One more behind, Barbara. There you go. Yep. Thank you. So the reason this is happening obviously is to remove the buy and bill incentive. And so what does this mean to the manufacturer is that obviously they need to have a strategy to either address this or sort of play in both worlds, one toe in specialty pharmacy, one toe in buy and bill, and just kind of let the market do its thing. We've heard that the contracts between payers and physician groups, sort of the newer contracts, the newly minted physicians that are starting their own groups or in sole practice, they are sort of, the payers are sort of not presenting them the option of buying and billing sometimes, and it's just you have to use a specialty pharmacy and that's the way it is. So that's a strategy that payers are using to kind of get more and more physicians away from buy and bill. Obviously, with the older established physicians and their groups, those contracts are, you know, there's usually no way that the buy and bill provision is going to get out of those contracts. So payers are just kind of targeting the newer contracts to say, okay, we're removing that option for you. The other place this is important is in, for example, a gene therapy. So it's been published that, you know, some payers, where possible, have been able to directly contract with a manufacturer such that they, again, remove any site of care markup that a hospital or physician group can apply. That's been done in the gene therapy space, as I said. And, you know, who knows, maybe we'll see that, because obviously we'll see that growing going forward, because obviously margin on a single digit margin on a couple $1 million or almost $1 million product is a lot of money. That does it really need to be there? That's what the payer's asking. So I think let's go to let's go to the next slide, and we'll talk about some alternative financing options. Is kind of the next the next theme here. So we've been talking a lot through the whole discussion here about about the sort of growing cost. There's growing budget impact related to both utilization and price increases. And nowhere is this more clear that there is a concern in the payer community than in the gene therapy space and sort of the very high cost agent space. We'll just call it that. It doesn't have to be a gene therapy, but some of the very high cost agents. So these 4 arrows here that you're looking at: performance risk sharing, annuities, installments, drug licensing, and reinsurance. These are all sort of in play or being discussed, and they are being discussed to address the 3 risks that you see on the left of the slide. So actuarial uncertainty, especially when you start to deal with rare diseases where a lot of these high cost therapies are. There's an uncertainty in the payer's mind about how many patients will I actually need to account for in any one plan year. Therapeutic performance, how can we really assess the long-term and real-world effectiveness of the treatments? And this is particularly a particular sticking point in a gene therapy curative approach, where your benefits are spread out over a patient's lifetime in some cases, and starting at a very young age, and spread out over the lifetime. And then, of course, the payment is immediate, at least in our current system, but the benefits are spread out over a lifetime. Payment timing, kind of just talked about that, but if a plan has to pay for a treatment that allows a benefit over a long period of time, like a lifetime, how do we track that patient? How do we ensure that any dollars we've sort of invested, quote unquote, in that patient, we can realize the benefit for over time? And so the 4 arrows are an attempt to address some of these uncertainties. And so we tested some versions of these in the research. And if you go to page 16, Barbara, we can go through the responses there. So just a couple of things to notice on these dials here. The little dots indicate where the different segments of the organizations were. So we have the small plans, medium plans, large plans, IDNs, and PBMs all have their own dot. So you can see, first off, no dots are really in the green zone, indicating strong likelihood of actually adopting the financial approach or the financing approach. However, again, and I'll just mention this point about the IDNs. The IDNs seem to be sort of at the forefront of the green zone here in nearly all of these alternative financing models. Again, we see that as a result, a consequence of their access to basically better data, harmonized medical pharmacy data, perhaps all going through a common EMR, makes everything easier. Patients generally stick with them for a long period of time based on employer, and they have the resources and the data resources, that is, to appropriately track and assess clinical outcomes for something like a performance agreement that where payment is based on efficacy. So, again, this point about none of these dots being strongly in the green zone here, we see some very strong uncertainty in changing the current model. There are a number of operational considerations as to why that is. That's a whole couple hour discussion in and of itself, but namely, it centers around access to data, harmonization of the data. Data privacy is always a concern. because a lot of these things have to be shared between manufacturer and payer in a way that's new and never been done before. So there are pilots out there, and there have been some publications around that as to the success of that, but it's still very, very new, and that's why we see this, as we said, the strong uncertainty in changing the current model. So I will, Barbara, we can go to the next one. That's a bit of the conclusion of sort of the didactic piece. I'll just mention our US Flagship Services here at the end here before we take the questions. You know, we have a senior US team, wealth of experience in consulting, strategy, small biotech, and major pharma, including commercial leadership roles at some of the major pharma. So our services focus on these 6 areas: launch planning, pricing, contracting, research and strategy, value story and evidence platforms, early value assessment and due diligence, value frameworks and ICER value assessments, health systems evolution and market scenario playbooks, looking at how things would change in a changing marketplace in the future. So let's go to the next one there to close it out. And Suzanne, I think we're gonna take some questions.
That's right. Thanks so much, Max and Barbara. And as Max said, we would love for you to put your questions in the question box for Max and Barbara, and we'll answer as many as we can. So Max, it looks like there's a question for you. Someone wants to know, how can a gene therapy manufacturer effectively plan clinical trials and other data generation such that it improves the access once launched?
Okay, yeah, so it starts very early. You know, I kind of alluded to this earlier. It's all about the planning before the regulatory and registrational trials and data are sort of cemented from the point of the regulator. You know, companies, especially pre-commercial companies, are almost always laser focused on getting regulatory approval, and maybe that's part of their corporate strategy. You know, totally agree. They're trying to get acquired, they're trying to do an out license, what have you, and sort of the key milestone for that is regulatory approval. Totally get that. However, thinking more longer term, you know, especially for a gene therapy, that data is really the foundation of the data, and it is the data that a manufacturer has to support the value at launch. When I mean support the value, I'm saying substantiate the price. And so any type of health economic modeling and value communication, all of that source data is really related to what's in the regulatory package. Yes, there will be post-market trials, but you have to support that value with the payer community at the time of launch, or really a few quarters before launch. So the question was how is plan early and assess any decision that is going to be set in stone from a regulatory perspective, assess what that means from a commercial perspective before you go down that road and commit there. So assess early, assess often.
Great. Looks like there's a question for you, Barbara. Someone wants to know, what is the source of a payer's standing to limit access to narrower than the approved indication for a drug?
Okay, right. So payers will argue that their decision to limit access to more specific groups is really, they will argue it's based on the evidence. They certainly don't do this in a vacuum. They always include KOLs to support their decisions. They will turn to guidelines. And importantly, they are looking at the published clinical study report and using the information that's been published in supporting their decisions. So, you know, from their perspective, they are following an evidence-based approach. It does, of course, create some tension between patients, physicians, and payers who, and this was sort of addressed, Aisha recently came out with a report on sort of this topic that we're discussing today, where patients and clinicians are feeling like payers are are getting too much weight in the process in their decision making. But on the other hand, payers are arguing they need to control these costs somehow, and they use evidence-based medicine in making their decisions. So that's sort of the payer point of view on that question.
Someone says, what are some outcomes that have been measured by IDNs using their data in alternative financing arrangements? For example, oncology relies on overall survival and progression-free survival. Are these surrogate endpoints used for these arrangements?
Yeah, so yeah, I think there was a paper published on this. I believe it was with Priority Health, looking at an agreement on bevacizumab, and yeah, I believe survival was part of it, but it wasn't the only metric. Remember, the IDN takes a holistic view, total cost of care. So they're going to be looking for things like, really utilization of everything. So specialist visits, inpatient stays, other ancillary pharmacy use, etc., all related to the indication. So I can't comment exactly specifically, but I do know that it would be a lot broader than also time on therapy is an important one to sort of get at efficacy. If if a patient stops taking it, the decision is made between patient and provider that's something's not working. Maybe it's a tolerability issue. So time on therapy is also measured as a surrogate for efficacy and hopefully outcomes. Yeah. Barb, anything to add on that one?
Yeah, just to add, these kind of financing arrangements won't work in every category. So payers certainly will look to measurable outcomes that can be measured in a reasonable amount of time, and it ultimately may not work well in the oncology category.
Yep.
That.
That's a great point. They're very category specific, exactly dependent on things like the questioner is asking. Do the outcomes even support? Do the sort of standard outcomes in this area even support an alternative financing arrangement? And that's sort of a feasibility assessment that needs to be done even before the manufacturer is approaching any payers on this point.
Looks like we have one final question. Someone wants to know, I think this is for Max, when is it better to have a limited distribution strategy for a product versus a broad distribution strategy?
Yeah, so I kind of talked through some of those things on that slide, but just to expand it, if there's a quote unquote high touch category, high touch patient category where you're concerned about tolerability, you're concerned about adherence, something like that, where you just want a greater level of interaction with the patient. The limited distribution strategy can help with that, because then you can engage a specialty pharmacy with a hub and all their services that they provide to achieve those goals. It also works well because obviously manufacturer pays for all those nice services. So it generally works well when there's, this is not a huge population, because then if you go limited, then you're kind of restricting access unnecessarily for a huge patient population. So it just doesn't work there. Also thinking about, generally rare diseases fit well. Yeah, so it's really anytime you need some additional, you think you're going to need some additional services there to support either therapy initiation or therapy adherence over time.
Great. Thank you so much, Barbara and Max. Barbara, if you could advance to the next slide, please. And thank you also to our audience for all those excellent questions. Before concluding the webinar, we have a few short announcements. You can register for all of our upcoming webinars by visiting Certara.com. On behalf of Certara, I would like to thank you for attending today's presentation. This concludes the webinar. Goodbye and have a great day.